The night my granddaughter asked me why the floor of this house is stone, the temperature outside had fallen to 9 degrees above zero. I know this because I had checked the thermometer before supper, the way I have checked it every evening for 40 years, the way a man checks on something he has learned not to take for granted. In Jade, the fire had burned down to coals 2 hours before. I had not added wood since mid-afternoon. Clara was sitting across from me with her feet tucked beneath her on the chair, the way young people sit when they are comfortable without knowing they are comfortable, and she looked at the floor, the flat limestone pieces fitted together like a slow gray puzzle. And she asked her question in the offhand way of someone who expects a short answer. I told her the answer was not short. She said she had time. She is 13 years old, and she has her grandmother's patience, which is the most useful thing a person can inherit. So I told her to put another small piece of wood on the fire, not a large one, just enough to keep the coals alive. And I told her about Marin Halverson. I told her about the winter of 1856 going into 1857. I told her about what a woman alone can build when she has decided to stop asking for permission from people who have nothing useful to tell her. I am 78 years old. I have built or helped build 41 structures in this county, and I will tell you plainly that not one of them works as well as hers did. I say this not as a confession, though it is one. I say it because it is the first thing you need to understand about this story. I was considered, at the time, the most skilled carpenter in Millhaven. And I did not see what Marin Halverson saw. I did not even know there was anything to see. That is where the story begins. Not with her, with the rest of us, and with the particular blindness of people who believe they already know how things are done. In the year 1856, the county of Millhaven in the Minnesota Territory had been settled for approximately 6 years, depending on how you counted and whose arrival you were willing to include. There were perhaps 230 families. There was a church, a general store run by a man named Old Marsh, a schoolhouse that operated 9 months of the year when the weather allowed, a blacksmith and a doctor named Whitfield who had come from Ohio with good intentions and a limited supply of the medicines that actually worked. The houses were built the way every house on the prairie was built in those years. A frame of milled pine or green-cut cottonwood, sided with rough boards, chinked between the planks with a mixture of clay and dry grass that shrank when the cold came and left gaps a man could sometimes see daylight through. The roofs were shingles or sod, the sod cheaper and more common. The floors were wood plank over a crawl space or in the poorer homes packed earth. Every house sat square on its lot on flat ground, oriented the way the street ran, which is to say with no particular thought given to which direction the wind would come from in February. The wind in February came from the north. I say this not to criticize the people who built those houses. I built several of them myself, and I built them the way my father had built in Bavaria, and the way the men around me built here, because it was what we knew, and because for the first several years the winters were hard but not extraordinary, and what we built seemed sufficient. Sufficient is a dangerous standard. It means this has not yet killed anyone. To heat a house through a Minnesota winter, an ordinary Minnesota winter, not the kind that was coming, a family burned between 3 and 4 cords of split hardwood. A cord is a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 8 feet long. 4 cords is a great deal of wood to cut and split and haul and stack, particularly if your land is river bottom clay without many trees, particularly if you are doing it while also farming and tending animals and keeping a household running. Every fall, the men of Millhaven spent weeks on wood. It was the largest single labor of the season, and when the supply wagons came from St. Paul with commercial wood to supplement what people had cut themselves, Old Marsh sold it as fast as it arrived. The supply wagons came from St. Paul on a road that was passable in most conditions. Most conditions is another dangerous standard. It means this has not yet failed us. I did not think about any of this as a problem in the summer of 1856. I thought about it as the ordinary shape of winter, as the cost of living in a cold place, as something you prepared for and endured and then forgot about in June. Most of us thought about it that way. It would not occur to me until much later that thinking about winter as something you endure rather than something you solve was itself a kind of failure. That realization came from watching a woman I barely knew do something that I, with all my training and all my tools, had never thought to do. Marin Halverson's husband Eric died in the second week of March, 1856, of the illness the doctor called consumption, which in those years was a name that covered many things a doctor could diagnose but not cure. Eric had come from the Telemark province of Norway. He was a quiet man of great patience and considerable skill with wood. We had spoken several times about joinery, about the behavior of different species under different moisture conditions, the kind of conversation that passes between craftsmen who respect each other's knowledge without necessarily knowing each other well. He had planned to expand and properly insulate the house that spring. He did not live to see that spring. He left behind a wife of 42 years, 160 acres of clay-heavy bottomland, a debt of $63 to the grain and supply, a milk cow named Borghild, 4 hens, a draft horse called Henrik, and an elderly aunt named Sigrid, who had come over from Norway with them and who lived in the small back room of the farmhouse and grew a garden of herbs that none of the neighbors recognized. The town responded to Marin's widowhood with the organized kindness that small communities produce in the first weeks after a loss. Meals brought to the door, offers of help with the spring planting, a collection taken up at the church that came to $11 and some cents. Mrs. Johansson at the boarding house offered Marin a room in exchange for help with cooking and laundry. Reverend Pell mentioned more than once that his wife's sister in St. Paul was in need of a companion. These were genuine offers made by people who meant well. Marin thanked each of them in the careful, formal English she had been building word by word since her arrival 3 years before, and she declined each one. She would keep the land. She would manage. The town accepted this with the particular unease that communities feel when a widow refuses to follow the expected path. People worried about her, genuinely worried, I believe, but the worry had an edge to it, the faint irritation of people whose helpfulness has been declined. She was not behaving correctly. She was alone on a difficult piece of land at the wrong age, and she was not doing what she was supposed to do, which was to simplify her situation by accepting the help being offered. She was not, as far as anyone could tell, grieving in any visible way. She went about her work. She was seen in the fields. She came to the store and paid her accounts and spoke civilly to everyone she encountered. She did not cry in church or accept the prolonged embraces of the women who offered them. This was noted. Grief, in a community's understanding of it, has an expected shape, and Marin's did not match the shape they were looking for. Some people said she was cold. Some said she had not truly loved Eric. Some said she was not right in the way that isolation and loss could make a person not right. I did not say any of these things. I did not say anything at all about Marin Halverson in the spring of 1856. I am not proud of this, but I record it honestly. I was a man of 33 with a carpentry shop on the main road and a full schedule of work, and the widow Halverson's state of mind was not my business, and I did not make it my business. I noticed her the way you notice things that are not causing you any direct difficulty, at a distance, without particular attention, as part of the general background of the town. It was in late May that I first saw her do something I could not explain. I was driving my wagon back from the Gustafson farm, where I had been measuring for a new door frame, and I came along the lower road that passes behind the Halverson property. The land there rises in a low ridge, barely worth calling a ridge, 8 or 10 feet of elevation over a long, gradual slope. The kind of feature you would not notice if you were not looking at the ground carefully. Marin was standing at the base of that slope with a sharpened stick, pushing it into the ground at intervals, crouching down to examine what came up on the end of it, moving a few feet and pushing again. There was a row of small stakes already in the ground behind her, evenly spaced along the contour of the slope. And beside the nearest stake she had set a wooden crate with what appeared to be 3 glass thermometers of the kind used for measuring milk temperature. She was writing something in a small leather book. I slowed the wagon without intending to. I watched her for perhaps 30 seconds. She did not look up. I drove on and did not think much more about it that day, because I had a door frame to draw up and 2 weeks of work ahead of me, and no particular reason to spend time puzzling over what a widow was doing with a stick and a thermometer in a field. But the image stayed with me in the way that certain things stay, not nagging, just present. Like a small stone in a shoe that does not hurt enough to make you stop but does not go away either. I mentioned it to no one. Others, I learned later, had made their own observations and were less reticent about sharing them. By June, the name had already started, not spoken to her face, that was not how these things worked, but exchanged between neighbors, passed along the pews on Sunday, murmured in the back of old Marsh's store among the men who gathered around the iron stove on slow afternoons. The strange widow, the one who keeps digging at the hill, the one who, as Gustafson put it to 3 men who repeated it to 6 more, appeared to be measuring the ground as if the ground owed her an answer. He said this as a joke. The men who heard it laughed. They did not know, none of us knew, that the ground did, in fact, owe her an answer, and that she was going to get it. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this world. The first kind is written down in books and taught in schoolrooms and passed between men at professional gatherings where everyone already agrees on the basic shape of things. It has the authority of print and the weight of repetition. Most people, when they want to know how something is done, go looking for this kind of knowledge, and most of the time it serves them adequately. The second kind lives in people. It travels not through books, but through conversation, through demonstration, through the slow transfer that happens when one person watches another person work and asks the right questions at the right moment. It is older than the first kind by thousands of years. It has survived ice ages and migrations and the particular violence that organized societies occasionally direct at the people who carry it. It survives because it works, not in theory, not under ideal conditions, but in the actual world, in the actual cold, with the actual materials available. Sigrid had the second kind. She had been carrying it for 40 years, waiting for the right person and the right place and the right necessity. When Eric died in March of 1856, and Maren sat down at the kitchen table with nothing ahead of her but open land and an open question, Sigrid understood that her waiting was over. I learned about these conversations years afterward from Maren's journals, which her daughter Anna, who became my wife, allowed me to read in the winter of 1888. By that time, Maren was in her 70s and largely done explaining herself to people, and she said I could read whatever I found useful. I found all of it useful. But the sections describing those spring evenings with Sigrid were what I returned to most often, because they contained the origin of everything that followed, and because they showed me, with more clarity than I was entirely comfortable with, how close we all came to losing the knowledge entirely. Sigrid had been born in the Finnmark province of Norway, the northernmost reach of the country, where the land flattens and the trees thin, and the cold arrives in October and does not leave until May. It is a place where the margin between adequate shelter and fatal shelter is a matter of degrees, not figuratively, but literally. The people of Finnmark had been building for that margin for 1,000 years before the first Norwegian farmer looked at the land and decided it might be worth trying to plow. Among those people were the Sami, the indigenous inhabitants of that far northern territory who had developed over centuries a precise and practical understanding of how cold moves through the world, how it behaves above ground, and how it behaves below, how the surface of the earth and the interior of the earth maintain entirely different relationships with the sky. The Sami built their winter shelters accordingly, not on top of the earth fighting the cold with fire, partially inside it, borrowing the Earth's own stability against the weather above. A Sami woman named Aslak Marit had taught some of this to Sigrid when Sigrid was in her 20s, not as a formal lesson, but as a neighbor teaching a neighbor. The way knowledge has always traveled best. Aslak Marit has no record in any document I have ever found. Her name appears only in Sigrid's recollections as recorded by Maren, and in a parenthetical note in Old Marsh's technical manual, which says simply, Source of Method, Sami tradition, Finnmark, transmitted through Sigrid, surname unknown, aunt of M. Halvorsen. This is the whole of her monument. It is not enough, but it is what exists. And I mention it here because it matters that we know where the knowledge came from, and that it did not come from nowhere, and that the woman who first understood these principles did not benefit from their application in Millhaven County, Minnesota, in the winter of 1856. These things should be said plainly. What Sigrid knew, and what she spent those spring evenings transmitting to Maren over coffee and flour sack diagrams, and the quiet persistence of a woman who understood she was running out of time, was this. The earth has a temperature, not the surface of the earth, which is at the mercy of the sun and the wind and the season, but the interior, below 4 feet, below the reach of the frost, below the zone where the weather's influence extends. At that depth, through the worst winter on the continent, the ground holds at a temperature between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It does not waver. It does not respond to blizzards. It is as reliable as a stone vault, which is, in essence, what it is. A structure built into that earth, not merely sitting on top of it, but genuinely embedded within it, with walls of compacted clay and a roof of layered sod, and an entrance designed to trap the cold air before it reaches the living space, can be heated to a comfortable temperature with a fraction of the fuel required to heat a frame house above ground. The earth provides what no amount of additional firewood can easily replace: stability, constancy. A floor that does not lose heat through its boards into an open crawl space. Walls that absorb the warmth of the fire and release it slowly through the night. A mass of material so large and so slow to change temperature that a single modest fire can sustain it for 12 hours. Maren listened to all of this with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything, not eager, not skeptical, but precise. She asked questions. She made Sigrid repeat certain points. She drew her own diagrams alongside Sigrid's and compared them and asked where they differed and why. She wrote everything down in her journal in a mixture of Norwegian and English, the two languages trading off depending on which one had the word she needed. And then, before she built anything, she went to look at the ground. The low ridge at the back of the Halvorsen property was not impressive. I have already said this, and I say it again because it is important. There was nothing about that rise of land that would have caused any sensible person to think it significant. 8 feet of elevation, perhaps 10, a gentle slope facing roughly south with a clay soil that was heavy and dense, and, in the eyes of every farmer who had looked at it, nearly useless for growing anything. Maren spent the better part of May looking at it the way her grandfather had apparently taught her to look at rocks, in layers, in time, with attention to what the surface was telling her about what lay beneath. She pushed a sharpened stick into the ground at 37 different points along the slope's face, recording in her journal the depth at which the soil changed character, where the clay gave way to other materials, where the ground was loose and where it was dense and coherent. She measured the angle of the slope with a plumb line and a straight edge. She tracked the movement of shadow across the face of the rise through the course of 3 full days, marking in her journal the hours during which the slope received direct sun and the hours during which it lay in shade. Then she dug the test holes, 3 of them, each 4 feet deep and 2 feet across, placed at intervals along the line she had identified as the most structurally reliable section of the slope. She covered each hole with a board weighted down with stones, and she placed one of the glass milk thermometers inside each one, resting it on a small shelf of clay she had cut into the wall of the hole at exactly 4 feet down. For 14 days, she read those thermometers every morning before anything else, recording the numbers in a column beside the date and the morning air temperature she measured simultaneously with a fourth thermometer hung on the north wall of the barn. The air temperature during those 2 weeks of June ranged from 51 degrees at its coolest to 79 degrees at its warmest. The temperature inside each test hole at 4 feet down read between 46 and 48 degrees every single morning. 14 readings per hole. 42 readings total. Not one of them fell outside that range by more than a degree. She wrote in her journal, in English, on the 14th morning, "Sigrid is right. The Earth does not argue with the weather. It simply waits." The design took another 3 weeks to finalize, and I mean design in the full sense of the word, not a rough sketch, but a considered plan with specific dimensions, specific materials, specific reasoning behind every choice. Maren was not building by instinct. She was building by calculation, the same way I build, the same way any craftsman builds who intends the work to last. She worked from 4 sources simultaneously. Sigrid's oral knowledge, which she had transcribed into her journal as precisely as she could. A book on Norwegian vernacular architecture she had ordered through Ole Marsh's store from a bookseller in St. Paul. Her own observations of the slope and its materials, and the accumulated practical knowledge of 3 years farming that land, which had taught her more about its clay and its water behavior and its frost depth than any book could have told her. The structure she designed was rectangular, 14 feet wide, 20 feet deep, embedded into the slope so that the back wall and the side walls were entirely underground, and only the front face, the entrance wall, stood at the surface. The floor would be set 3 feet below the original grade of the slope, which meant the walls on 3 sides would be surrounded by at least 3 feet of earth mass on their exterior. The ceiling would be at the original grade, giving a ceiling height of just under 8 feet at the entrance and rising to a full 8 feet at the back. The roof was what she thought about longest. Sigrid had described the Sami method in detail, 3 distinct layers, each with a specific purpose, and Maren had drawn it out and questioned it and drawn it again. The first layer was stripped sod, the top inch of prairie turf taken up in sections, and laid root side up directly on the rafters. The second layer, the one that most settlers who attempted sod roofing left out because it seemed redundant, was 12 inches of dry prairie grass, loose and uncompressed, packed into the space between the first and third layers. The third layer was another course of sod, laid root side down on top of the grass. The grass in the middle was the essential element. Not for its physical mass, it weighed relatively little, but for what it trapped, air, undisturbed air. Still air, sealed between 2 layers of dense sod, unable to circulate, unable to carry heat from one surface to another. Air correctly constrained does not conduct heat. That middle layer of loose grass was, in engineering terms, a thermal break. The same principle that makes a double-paned window work, the same principle that explains why a fur coat keeps an animal warm, not through any magical property of the fur itself, but because of the still air held within it. Every settler who built a sod roof and watched it fail within 2 years had omitted that middle layer. The roof compacted under its own weight, saturated in the spring thaw, and eventually admitted water that rotted the rafters from above while the frost crept up through the floor from below. The entrance was the element she revised most often. Sigrid had been emphatic on this point, and Maren's journal recorded several evenings of return to the question. The entrance could not be straight. A straight entrance was a direct channel for cold air, an invitation, in effect, for the worst the winter could produce to walk directly into the living space. The solution was a tunnel that turned, a covered passage, perhaps 8 feet long, that bent at an angle before opening into the main room. The physics of this were simple but not obvious. Cold air is denser than warm air. It flows downward and settles low. A bent entrance passage, with the inner doorway set several inches higher than the outer opening, created what Sigrid called, and Maren translated somewhat roughly, a cup that catches the cold and holds it away from you. The cold air flowed in, pooled in the lower section of the angled passage, and could not rise into the warmer air of the living space beyond. Even in a hard wind, even at temperatures that drove the thermometer to its lowest register, the bent entrance would hold a buffer of marginally warmer air between the outside world and the interior. I know this because I eventually built one myself, and I know it because on the coldest night of that terrible winter, when the temperature at the outer mouth of Maren's entrance tunnel read 30 degrees below zero, it read 12 degrees above zero 6 feet inside the first bend. That difference, 32 degrees bought by 8 feet of turned passage, is not nothing. In the winter of 1856, in that county, that difference was everything. Construction began on the 4th of August, 1856. Henrik, the draft horse, pulled the Fresno scraper along the line Maren had staked in the slope's face, cutting into the clay with a steady, methodical rhythm that she had taken 2 mornings to get right: the angle of the blade, the moment to lift, the amount of pressure on the handles. Eric had used this scraper for 3 seasons. She had watched him every time. She had, as I said before, paid attention. The first cut opened a shallow shelf across the face of the slope, 12 inches deep and 16 feet wide, the raw clay bright and pale in the August sun. She took the measurement, adjusted the stake at the north end by 4 inches, and ran the scraper back the other way. She did not ask for help that morning. Gustafsson watched from his fence line for perhaps 20 minutes and then went back to his own work. His wife, who told me about this several years later, said that he came in for dinner and reported that the widow Halverson had started something at the back of her property with Henrik and the scraper, and that he could not tell what it was going to be. His wife asked if it looked like it would work. He thought about it for a moment and said he didn't know enough about it to say. This was, I think, the most honest assessment anyone in Millhaven offered that August. The rest of them thought they knew enough to say. They said it freely, and they said it with the confidence of people who have not tested their confidence against anything more difficult than their own certainty. They said it right up until the moment the ground proved them wrong. The sandstone of Sentinel's Bluff yielded to the pickaxe in the source story. Clay does not yield. It resists in a different way, not the hard, bright resistance of rock, which at least has the honesty to announce itself, but a slow, dense, exhausting resistance, the resistance of something that has been compressed for 10,000 years and has no particular interest in being disturbed. Maren had known this. She had tested the clay with her stick for weeks before she began. But knowing a material and working it are 2 different educations, and the second one begins on the first morning you put a tool into the ground and feel the real weight of what you have undertaken. The Fresno scraper moved the surface efficiently. Below 14 inches, it began to struggle. Below 20 inches, Henrik was straining at each pass, his shoulders working hard, his breath coming in long pushes through the August heat. Maren adjusted her approach, shorter passes, a slightly different blade angle, more runs over the same ground before moving forward. The work slowed to perhaps 2/3 the pace she had estimated. She recorded this in her journal on the 4th day of excavation, not with alarm, but with the flat acknowledgement of someone updating a plan. Clay runs harder below the surface layer. Adjust time estimate by 1/3. Will need additional labor for the interior work if schedule is to hold. The schedule she was holding against was not arbitrary. It was the frost. The first killing frost in Millhaven County arrived, in most years, in the 1st or 2nd week of October. After the frost, working clay became significantly more difficult because the surface layer would harden, and the excavated material, once removed from the ground, would begin to freeze in the evening air and become unmanageable for the detailed work of wall preparation. She needed the main excavation complete, the walls treated, and at minimum the roof structure in place before October arrived. She had begun on the 4th of August. She had, by her calculation, between 8 and 9 weeks. I delivered lumber to the Halverson property in the last week of August. She had placed the order 6 weeks earlier, a specific list, dimensions precise to the quarter inch, including a note about moisture content that I found at the time mildly unusual for a customer to specify. Most people told you what they were building and trusted you to bring appropriate material. Marin told me the maximum acceptable moisture content for the ridge beam because she had calculated that the weight of the sod roof would exert a specific load on that beam over time, and a beam with elevated moisture content would creep under sustained load in ways that a dry beam would not. She was correct about this. It is a real phenomenon in structural timber. I knew it. I simply had not expected her to know it, and when I arrived at the property and found no one in the farmhouse and followed the sound of scraping to the back of the land, I was already in an uncomfortable relationship with my own assumptions. The excavation, by that last week of August, had progressed 40 feet along the face of the slope and perhaps 12 feet back into the hill. The cut face was clean and even, cleaner than I would have expected from scraper work, which typically leaves a rougher profile. She had gone back along the walls with a broad, flat spade, trimming and smoothing, working the surface in overlapping strokes the way you plane a board. The result was a wall face that was, structurally speaking, better than it needed to be for the next phase of construction. She was building with more precision than the task strictly required, which is the mark of someone who understands that imprecision accumulates. She was not there when I arrived. Henrik was at the fence line drinking from the trough. The lumber order was nailed to a post at the entrance of the excavation, a sheet of paper with the measurements written out a second time, in case I had lost the original, with a note that said she would be back before midday and that if I would wait, she had coffee on. I unloaded the lumber. I looked at the excavation for a long time. I stacked the timbers in the order she would want them, longest first, ridge beam separate and clear of the ground on blocks. Then I walked back to my wagon and picked up the coffee from the small fire she had left burning, and I waited. She returned from the Gustafson property, where she had gone to borrow a post-hole digger for the ventilation shaft work. She looked at the lumber, checked 1 or 2 pieces against the list, tested the ridge beam with her thumbnail, the way you test moisture content, and nodded. She paid me. I asked if she needed anything else. She said she could use an extra set of hands for 2 days to help raise the roof structure when it came to that. She named a wage. I said I would come. I drove back to town and said nothing to anyone about what I had seen. I am not certain I could have described it adequately. There are things you understand with the hands and the eyes that do not translate easily into the language of a conversation at the general store. There was a farmhand named Per. I never learned his family name, if he had one in common use, a boy of 16 who had been working for the Gustafsons since spring, and who began spending his afternoons on the Halverson property sometime in September. He told the Gustafson sons he was curious about what she was building. I think this was true. I also think he needed the small wage she paid him for the afternoon hours, and that the Gustafsons were not particular about what he did with his time after the main work was done. Per was not a talker. He was the kind of young man who expresses his state of mind entirely through physical action, working steadily when he was comfortable, working in short, distracted bursts when he was not. In September he worked steadily. He hauled material, he learned the clay mixture for the walls, he operated the small winch system Marin had rigged for raising heavy sections. He followed instructions without needing them, repeated. She wrote about him once in her journal, briefly. P understands the work. He does not ask why. I am not sure if this is a virtue or a problem. In the second week of September, the chimney failed. This was the first serious setback, and it deserves to be recorded honestly. Marin had designed a chimney that ran straight up through the mass of the roof, a stone-lined shaft, 18 inches square, rising from the central hearth through the full depth of the sod layers and emerging at the surface of the hill approximately 3 feet above the roofline. It was the obvious design. It was the design any sensible person would have drawn. She tested it before the roof was fully complete, building a small fire in the hearth location and observing the draft through the open shaft. The draw was adequate. The smoke rose cleanly. She recorded this result and moved on to the next task. What she had not tested, could not fully test, with the roof incomplete and the entrance open, was the behavior of the chimney in wind. The prevailing wind on that section of the slope came from the northwest. In a sustained northwest wind she discovered in the second week of September during the first significant autumn storm, the open chimney shaft acted not as an exhaust, but as an intake. The wind pressure at the surface was sufficient, at certain angles, to drive air back down the shaft and into the structure below. She built a small test fire during the storm to understand the full extent of the problem. The smoke came back. Not all of it, perhaps a third, but enough to make the interior of the unfinished structure uninhabitable within 20 minutes. Purr arrived that afternoon to find her sitting outside the entrance in the rain with her journal open on her knee, writing rapidly. He asked what had happened. She told him. He asked what she was going to do. She said she was thinking. He sat down beside her in the rain, apparently content to wait. She thought for 2 days. I know this because the journal entries for those 2 days are unusually long and densely written, pages of diagrams, alternative configurations, calculations I can follow only partially. She considered a hooded cap for the chimney which would block direct wind pressure, but would also reduce the draw in still air. She considered relocating the chimney to the leeward side of the structure, which would have required significant rework of the interior layout. She considered angling the shaft. It was the angling that she returned to, finally, not the entire shaft. That was unnecessary. Just the top section, the final 2 feet before emergence, bent in the direction of the prevailing wind so that the opening faced downwind rather than skyward. A chimney opening that faces downwind does not receive direct wind pressure. The moving air passes across it, and the Bernoulli effect, the same principle that lifts a wing, that draws smoke up a flue in a breeze, actually assists the draft rather than opposing it. When she dug out the upper section of the shaft to recut it at the new angle, she discovered the sand. A seam of it, 8 inches thick, running diagonally across the back quadrant of the excavation at a shallow angle, fine clean river sand, pale gold, dry as bone despite the rain soaking the clay around it. Old water had laid it down in a period before the river found its current channel, and old drainage had kept it dry ever since. It ran in the direction she needed. She followed it with her chisel for 14 inches, then another 8, letting the existing channel guide the new angle of the flue rather than cutting blind through solid clay. She wrote that evening, "The mistake found the answer. I would not have dug here otherwise. The sand was always here. The straight chimney would not have shown it to me." When she relit the fire 3 days later, the smoke rose, bent at the angled section, and emerged from the hillside in a thin, clean line that the wind took and dispersed immediately. Purr watched it for a full minute without speaking. Then he said it looked right. She agreed that it looked right. They went back inside to finish the wall treatment on the south face. The wall treatment was Sigrid's contribution, and it was the element that most of the neighboring farms, when they eventually built their own structures years later, got slightly wrong because they had not understood the reasoning behind it. Clay, when it dries, cracks. This is not a flaw in the material. It is simply what clay does when the water that gives it plasticity evaporates. The cracks are small at first, hairline fractures invisible to the eye, but they admit moisture in the spring thaw and cold air in winter, and they widen over time until the wall fails. Every earthen structure ever built has contended with this problem. Most solutions involve adding material to the clay mix that bonds the particles together and prevents the fractures from forming. Marin had tried the standard edition first: dry prairie grass, chopped short, mixed into the clay slurry at a ratio she had estimated from the architectural book. The result was better. The test panels she had made in July showed fewer cracks than untreated clay, but not good enough. There were still fractures along the grain lines of the grass fibers where the clay had pulled away from the organic material during drying. Sigrid suggested the addition on a Tuesday evening in the third week of September. Dried cattle dung, broken fine, mixed into the clay at a ratio of roughly 1 part dung to 8 parts clay by volume. Marin wrote in her journal that she resisted this suggestion for 2 days on grounds she described as aesthetic, which is as close to admitting squeamishness as she ever came in writing. Then she made a test panel using Sigrid's ratio, applied it to a section of the north wall, and waited 5 days for it to dry completely, not one crack, not a hairline. The surface was smooth and slightly dense, with a faint dark color and a quality that I can only describe, having run my own hand across it several years later, as finished. It felt like a wall that intended to stay. She applied the mixture to every interior wall surface over the following week, working with Per in 4-hour sessions that she recorded in the journal as the most physically exhausting single phase of the entire project. The mixture was heavy. The application required firm, even pressure over the full surface, working from the top down to avoid drip contamination of the finished sections below. Per quit in the last week of September. He came on a Thursday, worked a full afternoon without any sign of trouble, and at the end of the day told Marin that he would not be coming back. He did not give a specific reason, but she wrote in the journal that she knew the reason, which was that the Gustafson boys had said something to him at supper the previous night that she did not record and did not need to. The name had been circulating long enough to reach even a 16-year-old who generally kept to himself. She thanked him for his work. She paid him the full wage for the week, including the days he would not complete. He took the money and looked at the structure, at what the two of them had built over 6 weeks, with an expression she described as complicated, and walked back toward the Gustafson farm without looking back. She worked alone for the rest of September and into October. The first hard frost came on the 8th of October, which was 3 days earlier than the average. Marin had the roof structure complete, the sod layers applied and settling, the interior walls treated, and the stone floor laid across 2/3 of the living space. The limestone heating column at the center of the room was built to its full height. The bent entrance tunnel was finished. The cold store at the rear of the structure, a smaller, deeper cavity connected to the main room by a low opening, was excavated and lined. She was not finished. But she was far enough along that the frost no longer threatened the work. She lit the central hearth for the first time on the morning of the 9th of October and sat in her chair while the fire established itself and the smoke found its new angle and disappeared into the hillside above her, and she watched the thermometer she had hung on the interior wall and wrote down a number every 30 minutes for 2 hours. The number rose, steadily, without drama, the way real things work when they have been built correctly. Outside, the temperature that morning was 28 degrees. Inside, before she lit the fire, it had been 44. She did not go into town that day. She had no reason to. There was nothing in town she needed, and nothing she wanted to say to anyone there. She had been saying it, in clay and limestone and bent timber and dry grass packed carefully between 2 layers of sod, since the 4th of August, and the saying was nearly complete. The winter, which had been coming all along, began in earnest the following week. October gave way to November. November arrived cold and stayed cold, colder than the previous 2 years, with a quality that the older settlers in the county recognized without being able to articulate precisely: a dryness in the cold, an absence of the moderating effect of cloud cover, a sky that cleared after each weather system passed through and stayed clear, letting the accumulated warmth of the earth radiate upward and away into open space night after night. The temperature dropped a few degrees most evenings. It rose only reluctantly during the days. Old Marsh received his November inventory from the supply warehouse in St. Paul. He opened the ledger, read the figures for the incoming firewood shipment, and compared them to the figures from the previous 2 years and to his own estimate of what the county would need based on the current cold. He sat with the ledger open on his desk for a period of time he later could not specify. Then he closed it, returned it to the shelf, and went back out to the floor of the store. He did not post a notice. He did not call a town meeting. He did not say anything to the men who came in that week and stood at the stove and talked about the cold and said that it would surely break by Christmas the way it always did. He said, "Probably right." And he moved on to the next transaction. I did not know about the ledger until years later. When I found out, I understood something about that winter that I had not understood before. That what happened to Millhaven was not simply the consequence of a hard season. It was the consequence of a number, clearly visible in a column in a bound book, that a careful and intelligent man looked at and chose not to share. I do not know why he made that choice. I have thought about it for decades, and I still do not know. What I know is that the wood was not enough, that he knew the wood was not enough, and that the winter came anyway, indifferent to what had or had not been said. On the hillside, in the house that was and was not a house, Marin Halverson split a modest stack of cottonwood and stacked it inside the cold store, out of the weather. By her calculation, it was enough to last 4 months, used carefully. She had calculated correctly. The 28th of January, 1857, was the coldest day in the recorded history of Millhaven County. Dr. Whitfield measured minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit at 7 o'clock in the morning on the thermometer he kept mounted on the north wall of his office, where it received no direct sun and no warmth from the building's interior. He wrote the number in his diary and sat for a moment looking at it, and then added one sentence below, "I do not know how people will survive this." He was, by that point, already treating 2 cases of what he called frost fever, a systemic cold injury that settled in the lungs and joints and that he could address only with warmth and rest, neither of which were straightforward to provide when warmth itself was the scarcest resource in the county. 3 weeks earlier, on the 7th of January, 2 elderly men who lived alone on outlying claims had been found dead. The cold had come in through the walls of their houses, the way cold always comes in through walls, built without sufficient thought for what they would eventually be asked to hold out. An infant had died the week following. Dr. Whitfield noted all 3 deaths in his diary with the measured language of a man who has learned to write around the things that disturb him most. The firewood situation by late January had moved beyond scarcity into a register that people in comfortable circumstances do not generally have to name. Families were burning their chairs. The school had been closed for 6 weeks. Reverend Pell held Sunday services in Old Marsh's general store, gathered around the large iron stove at the room's center, the congregation standing close enough together that their collective body heat contributed meaningfully to the warmth of the space. Old Marsh attended these services and stood with the others and said nothing about his November ledger. 3 people had died. The temperature that morning was minus 43 degrees. On the same morning, at 7 o'clock, Marin Halverson's interior thermometer read 44 degrees Fahrenheit. She had not yet lit the morning fire. Lars Lindqvist came before sunrise. He came alone on foot across the frozen field between his property and hers, and I know this because he told me about it himself, several years later, with the particular care of a man describing something he is not entirely proud of and has decided to be honest about anyway. He said he left while his wife and children were still asleep because he needed to know the answer before he gave them any reason to hope. If the answer was no, he would go back and they would continue as they were. If the answer was yes, he would come back and get them. The question was not whether Marin would help him. He was certain enough about that. The question was whether there was anything real to come to, whether the stories about the warmth in the Hill House were genuine, or whether they were the kind of stories that circulate in a desperate winter because people need something to believe. He had lost his milk cow 3 nights before. She had been the last of his animals. Without her, his calculation of remaining food, made the previous evening in the particular mathematical clarity that extreme cold seems to produce in the mind, came to 11 days. He stood at the entrance to the bent tunnel and knocked on the wooden door at its inner end. He heard movement inside. The door opened and Marin stood there, dressed, already awake. She had always risen before light, with a candle in her hand and the faint warmth of the interior pressing out around her into the dark cold of the passage. He told her about the cow. He told her the number, 11 days, without embellishment. He did not mention his children because he did not want to trade on them, and she did not ask about them because she was already moving back into the room to put wood on the coals. "Come back in 2 hours," she said. "Bring your family and whatever food you have left." He said he did not want charity. She said she did not remember offering any. She said she needed people who could work, and that she had been working alone for 3 months, and that his hands looked like they knew what a shovel was. Then she handed him a cup of broth from the pot that had been sitting at the back of the hearth through the night, still warm, warm enough, and told him to drink it on the way back and return the cup when he came. He stood in the entrance tunnel for a moment. He told me he was trying to understand the temperature. Outside, where he had walked 40 minutes in the dark, it had been, by his body's reckoning, something close to the coldest thing he had ever experienced. Inside the tunnel, in the section just beyond the bend where he was standing, it was cold. He would not have called it warm, but it was not the same cold. There was a difference of character, not just degree. The air was still. It did not take anything from him. He drank the broth. He walked back across the field. He woke his family. Within 10 days, 11 families had come to the Hill House with what they could carry. Marin organized it without ceremony and without waste of motion, the way she organized everything. The very sick and the very young and the elderly stayed inside, rotating through the warmest positions near the column of limestone that had been absorbing fire heat since October and now radiated it with the steady generosity of something that has been storing up for exactly this purpose. The healthy adults worked in shifts, keeping the fire calibrated, managing the food supply, tending the animals that had been brought up and installed in the livestock shelter cut into the hillside east of the main room, packed close enough together that their collective warmth raised the space another 3 degrees. I came on the 8th day of February with my tools, because I had observed on my first visit that the entrance tunnel was creating a bottleneck for the volume of traffic it was now receiving, and that widening it by 6 inches on each side could be accomplished without compromising the structural integrity of the earth above it. I spent 2 days on this work. Marin watched the first hour and then left me to it, which I understood as the clearest possible form of professional acknowledgement. Lars Lindqvist spent those same days reinforcing the central limestone column under her direction, adding mass to the upper section to increase its heat storage capacity. He had been a stonemason in Sweden before he was a farmer in Minnesota, and his hands found the work in the way that trained hands find familiar work, quickly, quietly, with a confidence that has nothing to prove. Old Marsh came on the 11th of February with his wife and his account books and a separate blank ledger that he had brought for reasons I did not understand until I saw him open it and begin writing. He sat in the corner nearest the entrance, where the light was best and the temperature somewhat lower than at the center of the room, and he wrote down everything Marin said when she explained something to anyone. He wrote it in the clean, specific language of a man who has kept accurate records his entire adult life and understands that accurate records are a form of responsibility. He asked clarifying questions when he needed to. He did not editorialize, and he did not apologize. I watched him fill 20 pages in 3 days. I thought about the November ledger, and I said nothing. Some debts are settled in ways that don't require acknowledgement from the creditor. On the 28th of January, Doctor. Whitfield had written, "I do not know how people will survive this." By the 15th of February, he had his answer. He came to the Hill House to check on his patients. The 2 cases of frost fever, the 3 children who had developed respiratory congestion in the weeks before their families made the journey up the slope, and he stood in the entrance for a long moment before he said anything. Then he asked Marin if he could see her temperature records. She gave him the journal, open to the pages of twice-daily readings going back to November. He read them with the attention of a man reading a clinical document, which is what they were. He said quietly that he wished he had known about this in December. She said that it had been there to see. He accepted this without defense, which I thought well of him for. Then he asked if she would be willing to explain the construction principles to him so that he could include them in his own records. She said yes, and they sat down together at the table she had built from the lumber I had delivered in August. And she explained, and he wrote, and outside the temperature was -21 degrees, and inside it was 56. The winter broke in the 3rd week of March, as winters do. Not all at once, but in degrees, each day holding a few more minutes of warmth than the last, the quality of the cold changing from brittle to merely sharp to something that felt, after those weeks, almost gentle. The families returned to their own properties and began to assess what remained and what would need to be rebuilt. Lars Lindqvist staked out a site on the low rise at the back of his own land and ordered lumber from my shop with dimensions he had written in his careful stonemason's hand in a notebook he had kept through February. He built his own structure that spring, consulting with Marin at each significant phase, and moved his family into it by September. His children grew up in a house that was never cold. Old Marsh published his ledger in a small edition printed in St. Paul. He titled it plainly, Notes on Practical Earth Building in the Northern Territories. The first page credits Marin Halverson. In a parenthesis, in smaller type, it credits Sigrid, surname unknown, and, through her, a Sami woman named Aslak Marit of Finnmark, Norway. A copy of that book was carried west by a family named Thorson in the autumn of 1863 and reached a settlement in Brookings County, Dakota Territory, where a man named Eric Thorson read it through the winter and broke ground the following April. In the winter of 1864, with temperatures that reached 38 below, the Thorson family lost no livestock and burned less than a cord of wood. These are facts I gathered over years. Marin herself did not speak much about what the winter had meant or what it had changed. She continued to farm, to improve the structure on the hill, to expand it as the years allowed. Additional rooms carved back into the slope, a second livestock shelter, a greenhouse of sorts, framed in glass salvaged from a failed commercial venture in Mill Haven, positioned to catch the winter sun on the south face of the hill. She lived there until she died, in January of 1890, at 76 years old. I know the temperature that morning because I have the habit, as I said, of checking. Outside it was 14 below zero. Her room, which Sigrid had taught her to build, which Aslak Marit had understood before either of them were born, which the cold of 10,000 Minnesota winters had shaped and tested and confirmed, her room was 47 degrees. She died warm. Clara is watching the fire now, or watching the coals that the fire has become, the way young people watch things that are beginning to make sense to them. Outside it is 9 degrees. The thermometer has not moved in 2 hours. The floor is stone. Flat limestone pieces fitted together by hands that have built 41 structures in this county and learned, finally, to build them the way the ground itself suggested. She asks me what happened to Per, the farmhand who left. He came back, I tell her, in February, during the worst of it. He appeared at the entrance one morning and picked up a shovel without saying anything to anyone. I do not know what changed his mind. Some things you do not ask. She thinks about this. Then she asks the question I have been waiting for since the beginning, the one that tells me she has understood the story, not just as a story, but as the thing underneath it. She asks, why didn't anyone build this way before? I am quiet for a moment. The coals settle. The room holds its warmth the way it has held warmth for 23 winters, steadily, without drama, the way real things work when they have been built with understanding. Because we thought we already knew how, I tell her. And when you are certain you know how, you stop looking for a better answer. Marin was not certain. She had just lost her husband, and she had nothing left to be certain about. So she looked at the ground instead of the sky, and she listened to an old woman that most people had dismissed, and she found an answer that had been there all along, waiting, the way the earth waits, without impatience, for someone to finally ask the right question. Clara looks at the floor for a moment. Then she looks up at me. She says, "So the house knows something." "Yes," I tell her, "that is exactly right. The earth remembers." Marin Halverson listened to what it remembered. The rest of us, in time, learned to listen too.